The night the great blizzard swallowed our valley, and the sighted men who went out into it came back lost, or did not come back at all. The one person who walked into that howling white nothing and came home again, and not alone, was my brother Thomas, who had been blind since he was 6 years old, and whom the whole of us had spent our lives quietly pitying as the one member of the family who would always need looking after. That night it was Thomas who did the looking after. That night the blindness we had grieved over for 30 years turned out to be the one thing in our whole valley that the blizzard could not take away. Because you cannot blind a man who has already learned to live without his eyes. Let me tell you who I am and why this falls to me. My name is Daniel Reese, and Thomas was my younger brother, and I loved him the way you love someone you have always thought of as weaker than yourself, which is to say, with a tenderness that had condescension mixed all through it, and never knew it. I spent 30 years being gentle with Thomas, and a little sorry for Thomas, and quietly certain that Thomas was the one of us that life had cheated. It took a single winter night to show me that I had never once, in all those years, understood what my brother actually was, and I have carried the correction ever since, and I want to set it down before I go, so that at least the truth of him outlives my long misunderstanding of him. Thomas lost his sight to a fever when he was 6, and our family did with him what families did then, which was to fold him carefully into a smaller life. We were farm people in a high, cold valley, and there was no school for the blind within reach, and no notion in any of us of what such a person might become. And so Thomas grew up at the edge of the work, given the safe, small tasks, kept close to the house, watched over. And he bore it, and he was not bitter. But he did for himself, quietly, over the years, a thing none of us fully noticed, which was that he learned our whole world by every sense except the one he lacked, and learned it far more thoroughly than any of us knew it, because we had eyes and did not need to, and he had no eyes and had no choice. While we saw the farm, Thomas memorized it. He knew the number of paces from the kitchen door to the barn, to the well, to the woodpile, to the fence corners, to the road, not roughly the way you might, but exactly, counted and fixed and never forgotten. He knew the ground underfoot, where it rose and fell, where the path packed hard and where it went soft, where the old cart ruts ran. He knew the sounds of the place, how the wind spoke differently against the barn than against the house, how the creek could be heard from certain spots and not others, how sound carried or died in different corners of our land. He knew the smells that marked one place from another. He built in his mind, over 30 patient years, a map of our whole valley more complete and more reliable than any of us sighted people carried, because ours was a lazy map that leaned entirely on the eyes and collapsed the moment the eyes failed, and his was built to work in the dark, because for Thomas, it was always the dark. There was a thing about Thomas that we all knew and thought little of, and I set it down now because it became the hinge of that whole terrible night. He kept ropes. All around our home place, Thomas over the years had strung guide ropes, cords run from the house to the barn, from the barn to the well, along the paths he traveled most, tied off at a height his hand fell to naturally, and he moved along them sure and quick when he went about his tasks. We had grown so used to Thomas's ropes that we did not see them anymore, and when strangers asked, we explained them with that faint, apologetic pity. The blind man's strings, we called them, the way he finds his way, poor fellow. We thought them a sad necessity, a crutch. It never entered our sighted heads that Thomas had built, all unremarked, across our farm, the exact system that saves lives in a blizzard. The lifeline that a sighted man learns to run between his house and his barn only when the great storm comes and teaches him, too late sometimes, that in a whiteout he is as blind as any blind man and needs a rope to find his own door. Thomas had been living every day of his life by the wisdom that the blizzard forces on the sighted only once a year, and we had pitied him for it. What I understand now, and did not understand then, is that my brother was not a diminished version of a sighted man. He was a different, and in some ways, a more complete kind of person. One who had developed, out of necessity, whole capacities that the rest of us let sleep because we never needed them. We navigated by sight alone, and so our sight was everything, and our other senses were half asleep. And take away the light, and we were helpless children. Thomas navigated by memory, by touch, by hearing, by the feel of the wind and the slope of the ground and the count of his own steps, by a dozen fine instruments the rest of us owned and never troubled to use. And so, when the one sense we all relied on was taken away from everyone at once, on the night of the great storm, Thomas was not plunged into darkness like the rest of us. Thomas was simply in the world he had always lived in, the only one of us at home there, and the rest of us were the ones suddenly struck blind and helpless, and in need of a man who knew the way in the dark. He told me once, long before that winter, a thing I did not grasp until the storm made me grasp it. I had said something to him, meaning it kindly, about how hard it must be to live in the dark all the time. And Thomas smiled and said, "It isn't dark to me, Daniel." He was quite easy about it. Dark is just what you call it because you'd be lost in it. I go by other things. I did not know what he meant. I found out what he meant on the worst night of my life, when the dark came for all of us, and Thomas was the only one who was not lost in it. There is a thing worth saying here about how the rest of us lived, because it is the whole reason we were helpless, and he was not. We navigated our valley the lazy way that seeing people do, which is to glance up, recognize a landmark with the eye, and never think of it again, so that our knowledge of our own home was thin as paper and lived entirely in our eyes. Ask any of us how many paces from the porch to the barn, and we could not have told you within 20. We had never counted, because we had never needed to count, because we could always just look. Thomas could have told you to the step for every path on the place, because counting was not a chore he did once, but the very substance of how he lived, renewed and confirmed 100 times a day, year upon year, until the map of our valley was not written on paper or held in the eye, but built into his body, into his legs and his hands and his ears, where no storm could reach in and erase it. That is the difference the blizzard exposed. Our knowing was borrowed from the light and vanished when the light did. His knowing was his own, made without the light, and the darkness that undid us could not touch it, because it had been made in the dark to begin with. Now, I will not pretend Thomas's way of living was without cost, or that it made him some marvel who needed nothing, for that would be its own kind of failing to see him true. The ropes and the counting and the whole careful architecture of his independence had limits, and inside those limits he was free, and beyond them he was not, and he knew the exact line better than we did. He could not, for all his knowing, go safely into truly unfamiliar country. His mastery was of the ground he had learned, and off his map he was as lost as anyone. More so. And there had been a hard lesson in that once, years before, that mattered on the night of the storm. For Thomas had, as a younger man, been too confident, had once gone out beyond his known ways, trusting he could manage, and had become lost and frightened, and been found only by luck, cold and shaken. And it had taught him a caution he never afterward abandoned, a strict humility about the edges of what he knew. That old fright, that hard-learned knowledge of his own true limits, turned out to be as important as all his skill, because it meant that on the night of the blizzard, Thomas did not attempt the impossible and get himself and others killed by overreaching. He knew, to the pace, exactly how far his mastery ran, and he worked within it, and that discipline was the difference between a rescue and a second tragedy. The winter that year had been hard from the start, and the old people had been reading bad signs in it for weeks, and I will tell you how the night itself came, for it came the way the killing ones do, fast and disguised. The day had been merely cold and gray, nothing to fear, and a number of our valley's people were abroad in it about their business. Some children still at the little school 2 miles up the valley. Some men out with stock or on the roads. My own 2 boys among those coming home late from helping a neighbor. And then, in the space of a single hour, near dusk, the wind swung into the north and rose to a scream, and the snow came down and sideways all at once, and the temperature fell away beneath us like a dropped stone, and the world simply disappeared into a roaring white blindness in which a man could not see his own outstretched hand, could not tell up from down or north from south, could not find a building 20 feet away, could not do anything at all but be lost. The whiteout. The particular killer of that country. The storm that murders not by cold alone, but by blindness, by taking every landmark and every direction from you at once, so that people die within a stone's throw of their own doors, having walked in circles in the white until they can walk no more. And our valley, that evening, had too many of its people out in it, and the dark coming down, and the storm worsening by the minute. And among those not yet home were children. And as the truth of the thing broke over us, the sighted men of my family and the neighboring places did the brave and natural and useless thing, which was to light lanterns and go out into the white to find the lost. And the storm swallowed them as easily as it had swallowed the rest. The lanterns were worse than useless, and that is the first thing the night taught us, though it cost us to learn it. A lantern in a whiteout lights nothing but the wall of driving snow a foot in front of the glass, blinds you further with its own glare thrown back at you, and gives you the deadly illusion that you can see, so that you trust your eyes, and your eyes lie to you and lead you in circles. 2 of the men who went out with lanterns to search came staggering back by pure chance, having found nothing, half frozen and badly frightened. And 1 did not come back at all just then, and was another of the lost. And within the first hour it was plain that every sighted person who went into that storm was simply adding themselves to the list of those who needed saving. We stood in the house in a rising panic, my mother and my wife and I, with children and men still out in the white and dying, most likely, as we stood there, and no way under heaven to reach them, because the one thing a rescue needs is the ability to find your way there and back, and the storm had taken exactly that from every one of us. Every one of us but Thomas. I remember the moment I turned to him, and I am not proud of it, because in 30 years of loving my brother, I had never once turned to him as the strong one, the capable one, the one who could do the thing that had to be done. But I turned to him then, in my desperation, hardly knowing why, and I found him already dressed for it, already wrapping himself to go out, calm in the middle of our panic. And I understood, all at once, and far too late, what my brother was. He said, "The school first, the children." And he said, "Daniel, you'll come behind me on the rope and do the carrying, but you'll go where I say, and you'll not let go of the rope for anything, because out there you're the blind one, not me." And God help me, it was the truth, and we both knew it, and for the first time in our lives, I did as my blind brother told me, and it saved lives. I will tell you what my brother did that night, and it was the plainest thing and the most extraordinary, and there was no magic in a moment of it, only 30 years of a blind man's patient knowledge suddenly worth more than every seeing eye in the valley. Thomas went out into the whiteout that had defeated every sighted man, and he was not defeated by it, because it took nothing from him that he had not already lost and learned to live without. He went by his counted paces and his memory of the ground and the feel of the wind's direction on his face and the slope under his feet, the whole array of senses he had spent a lifetime sharpening while hours slept. And he moved through that killing blindness as surely as he moved through his own kitchen, because to him there was no difference. It was all the dark he had always lived in. He found the rope he had strung to the barn, and from the barn he struck out toward the school road along a way he had walked 1,000 times and held entire in his mind, counting always counting. And I came behind him, clinging to the line he paid out, carrying the coiled ropes and the blankets, seeing nothing, trusting my blind brother with my life and the lives we went to save. He found the schoolhouse, 2 miles in a whiteout that had turned back every man who tried it with his eyes, and Thomas walked to it nearly straight, because he did not need to see it. He needed only to know where it was and how to get there. And that he had carried in his head for 30 years. The teacher and the children were huddled in the cold schoolhouse, the fire near out, afraid to leave because they knew, sensibly, that to go out into that white was to die, and they were right, for them. But Thomas strung his rope from the schoolhouse door and led them back along it and along the line I had helped anchor, hand to hand, a chain of children, each holding the rope, my brother at the head of it, feeling his way home through the storm by the map in his mind, and I at the rear, making sure not one small hand lost its grip. And he brought them down that valley through the very heart of the blizzard and delivered every one of them alive to the warm houses. And then, that done, he went back out, twice more, for the men who were lost in the near fields, and he found 2 of the 3, following their calls when they could call, and his own knowledge of where a man blundering blind would likely have drifted to, and he brought them in too. There is no need to dress up what saved those children and those men, because the truth of it is finer than any dressing. It was not courage alone, though Thomas was brave. Sighted men had been brave that night and had only gotten lost. It was that my brother possessed, and the rest of us wholly lacked, the ability to navigate without sight. And on the one night when sight was worthless to everyone, that ability was the only thing in the valley that could find the lost and bring them home. All his life, the world had defined Thomas by what he could not do, had seen him as a man minus his eyes, a diminished thing. But he was never a sighted man made lesser. He was a man who had built his entire life on the foundation the rest of us only discover we need when the storm strikes us blind. And so, when it came, he was ready, as none of us could be, not because he was braver or stronger, but because he had been preparing for a lightless world every single day of his life, having no other, while we had been living carelessly in the light and were lost the instant it failed. I will be honest that it was not a night without loss, for the whiteout took its price, as it always did, and I will not tell it as a clean triumph. One of the men who had gone out early with a lantern before Thomas could be turned to was not found until morning, and not alive. And there were animals lost and hardship enough in that valley that night to mark it forever in our memories. Thomas saved many. He could not save all. No one could have. And he was the first to grieve the one he could not reach, and to refuse any word that made him more than a man who had done what he could within the limits he knew. And those limits were real, and he stayed strictly inside them even that night, would not go after the men he judged to be beyond his known ground, because he knew that to exceed his map was to become lost himself and turn a rescuer into one more of the lost. And it took a bitter wisdom to hold that line, to accept that even he could not reach everyone, but holding it was why he came home alive to save as many as he did. When the storm broke and the sun came up on a white and glittering and terrible morning, our valley counted itself and found that it had come through with most of its people alive, its children all alive, and every soul in that valley knew exactly why, and knew exactly who. And I watched my valley's regard for my brother change in the space of that single morning, from the gentle pity of 30 years into something it had never held for him before and never lost again, which was respect, plain and deep and a little awed. The men who were carried home by a blind man did not forget it. The parents of those children did not forget it. And I, who had been the worst of them in my long, tender condescension, because I was his brother and should have known him better and had not, I did not forget it. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to make up for 30 years of not seeing the man who saw better in the dark than any of us saw in the light. The valley learned something that outlasted its gratitude, and it is the thing I most want to leave you with. After that night, no one in our valley spoke of Thomas, or of anyone like him, in quite the old, pitying way again. For they had seen with their own eyes that what they had called his affliction was, in the 1 hour it mattered most, the saving of them, and that a man they had counted as needing everyone's help was the one who, when the true test came, helped everyone. It made us think, all of us, about how carelessly we had measured a person's worth by whether he was made like the most of us, and how nearly we had wasted, in our pity, the very gifts that saved our children's lives. Thomas lived long among us after that, honored and consulted and loved without condescension at last, and he strung his ropes and counted his paces and went surely about his dark and capable life. And more than one hard winter after, when the whiteout came down, it was Thomas the valley turned to. Thomas, who walked out into the blindness that trapped us all and brought home the lost, our blind brother, the only one of us who was never lost in the dark. I am an old man now, and Thomas is gone these many years, and I have told this to my children and my grandchildren, and now to you, because the world is quick, still, to pity and to pass over the ones it thinks are lesser, and I have reason to know how blind that pity is. People hear this and think it is a story about a brave, blind man, and it is, but it is more than that. It is a story about how the thing a person is pitied for can be the very strength that no one else possesses, and how a community can look straight at such a person for 30 years and see only what he lacks, and never once see what he has. My brother was not a lamp that had gone out. He was a different kind of light entirely, one that burned in the dark where all our lamps failed. And it took the greatest darkness any of us ever knew to let us finally see him. Do not wait for your blizzard to see the people you have been pitying. Look now, in the good light, at what they carry that you do not. For the day may come when the light fails everyone, and it is the one you counted least who knows the way home. Now, this family is ours, but here is what is true. The whiteout blizzard was among the deadliest dangers of the northern frontier, precisely because it blinded everyone, taking away every landmark so that people froze to death within yards of shelter, having lost all sense of direction. The guide rope, run between house and barn, was a real and vital practice, because in such a storm, a sighted person truly is as blind as a blind one. And it is a documented reality that people who lose their sight develop heightened reliance on memory, hearing, touch, and spatial counting, building detailed mental maps that let them move confidently through familiar spaces without vision, exactly the capacities that a whiteout renders priceless. There are real accounts from many hard winters of blind or blindfolded people leading the sighted to safety through storms in which sight was useless. The people of this valley are imagined. The whiteout, the lifeline rope, and the plain truth that the one the world pities may be the one who knows the way when the light fails, are exactly as they were.